The night the air learned to kill began with a sound nobody could name. It came from the Lake bottomless thud that rolled through volcanic hills and split the conversations of people eating yams, tending cooking fires, tying goats to lightweight steaks. Lake Nyos had always been a patient circle of black water, cupped by steep crater walls and a natural dam of old ash and rock. In the day it held the sky like a mirror. At dusk, it swallowed everything. On this night, in late August 1986, in the northwest of Cameroon, it coughed. A fisherman on the shore saw the surface bulge and boil as if the moon had slipped beneath and tried to stand up. Water heaved in a ring, a column of white foam spray. Something rose into the dark like a tree, and then a wave ran out from the center and broke against the inner banks. He took one step back without knowing he had moved. Up the slope in Nyos village, a woman paused in the door of a mud-walled house. The evening had been ordinary. Children whispering themselves to sleep, the low talk of cousins and aunts, cattle herded home before night penned them. Now a chorus of dogs began to bark and then, as if agreeing to something, stopped. The air on her tongue tasted wrong. Flat, metallic, like breathing a coin. She reached for the lantern hook. Out of habit, the flame dimmed without her touching it. She thought of the story the market women told 2 years ago about another lakeman where 37 people had been found dead around an old track. No wounds, no smoke, only open eyes. And a silence even the flies respected. She had carried the story home, but not the fear. Fear is too heavy to lug into tomorrow. On the road that ran the spine of the valley, a driver nursed a battered truck down toward the bridge because there was always someone needing a ride at the hour when day and night overlap. The hills were dark, but not unfriendly. He was thinking of a cousin in Wum and the price of petrol when the fog appeared at the bend. Not lying low the way fog does, but pushing forward a wall that looked like cloud and moved like a held breath released. It slid across the asphalt with the certainty of water in a canal. Back at the lake, the bulge had become a boil. Deep water, heavy with memories of rock and pressure, was reaching up cold fingers. Without anyone to name it, the science was simple and terrible. For years, gas had been seeping up from magma far below and dissolving into the lake's bottom water, held there by the weight of the lake above like carbonation in a bottle that has never been opened. The lake had become meromictic, stratified into layers that did not mix. The surface sunned itself. The depths grew thick with invisible breath. On this night, something in underwater landslide, a cool rain chasing warm winds, an internal wave pushed to far jolted one layer into the other. The cap failed. Gas came out of solution not timidly, but all at once, thousands upon thousands of tons of carbon dioxide erupting, upward in bubbles that lightened the column of water and made it rise faster, which made more gas come out. A loop, once begun, cannot be politely asked to stop. The roar reached the village as a whisper through mud walls. A boy rolled in his sleep and dreamed of drumming. A mother felt the room tilt in some way the walls couldn't show. Down by the shore, a goat pulled twice at its rope and then dropped without struggle, head folded to chest like a sleeping kid. The fisherman took another step back and found he could not make his lungs obey. He opened his mouth, because that is what lungs teach you to do each time they want. Nothing came that felt like life. The truck hit the edge of the cloud as if entering water. The driver's breath shortened, first with surprise and then in a cascade of reflex and unreason. He pressed the accelerator out of habit. The engine answered, starved, and died. He turned the key. The starter clacked like a spoon, dropped on a floor. He laughed once, hard, at the absurdity of it, reached for the door handle, and found his hands stupid. Dense air poured through the vents. It had no smell that made sense. Carbon dioxide has no scent at all. Some later would say they tasted a bitterness like vinegar, or a faint sulfur, because a lake holds what it is given. A trace of hydrogen sulfide, a lick of other volatile. But this was mostly the breath of the planet turned back on those who had given it no offense. Heavy, colorless, it slid downhill, hugged the contours of gullies and roads, pooled in low places the way fog never quite remembers to do. It displaced the oxygen because it could. Up in Cha village, a father stepped outside to pee and felt his knees fold as if a joke had been made at his expense by an old friend. He put his palms on the ground. He put his forehead there and did not mind the dirt. Inside, his wife called his name without worry. Then again, shape of it changing. In Saboom, a sleeping child turned her face away from the doorway and tucked her hand under her cheek as if refusing the invitation of a new dream. Cattle lay down where they stood, hooves skittering against stone in a brief percussion that ended like a sentence, stopped mid-word. The fisherman on the lakeshore tried to stand. Cooled. Not. He thought of the market story then, very briefly, and thought, I am inside it. He put his head down, as animal and human both do when air becomes work. The lake behind him hissed softly. A thin white band of foam licked at the shore and then withdrew. The night, in all other respects, continued. Crickets ground their legs together out of habit, until they did not. On the far side of the ridge, where the valleys fell away toward the plains, a woman on a farm heard the cough of cattle and went to the threshold to cluck her tongue at them. The sound that came back was the fog without sound. The lantern on the peg next to the door burned weaker, a flame tired of pretending. She stepped out. The world had no taste now, or only the taste of stone. Her breath shortened in beats, like footsteps. She turned her head upslope and tried instinct, because it is older than language. The low drift met her at the waist and rose. On the road, the driver shoved at the door with a shoulder because the old truck had never agreed to be opened gracefully. The handle gave. The door swung. He slid first one leg, then the other into air that was a floor. He put his hand on the guardrail and laughed once more, small as a cough. The fog pressed at his ankles, then his knees, then rose with the kind of patience that ends stories. His head filled with a slow drum of panic, not a bang but a beating. His vision narrowed to a tunnel that had nothing at the end of it. He felt, in the stitch of a second longer than forever, that something vast had rolled over the world with no interest in whether anyone was there to be rolled over. Back at the lake, the fountain sank and rose and sank again, the surface flexing as gas blew out in invisible bellows. There would later be numbers for this. 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide released. A column of water turned inside out, a wave that ran at the inner rim and tore out trees and plants, and left a collar of scoured earth. But here, now, the numbers were not present. Only a cloud moving with purpose, heavy and sure, seeking every valley where breath had been stored. The woman in Nyos reached again for the lantern. The flame went out with a courtesy that felt like insult. The room went dark, as if someone had put a palm over her face. She turned toward the pallet where her children slept, and took a step she did not complete. Outside, the dogs did not bark, and from the lake slip, as if swept forward by the hand of something that had never been born and will never die. The wit opaque nothing came on, low, swallowing stones and grass and the bottom half of houses, cresting the offer of the road where a truck sat crooked in silence. It poured across the bridge, shouldered the truck aside with a touch that was no touch at all, and went looking for lungs. In Cha, in Saboom, in Mashi, in Nyos itself, the first bodies to drop were animals. Goats folded neatly. Cattle stumbled and knelt as if in prayer. Chickens toppled in dozens like a child's game scattering. People followed in a cadence, measured by where they were in the valley. Chest height, waist height, knee height, the invisible tide filling what the earth had carved. A mother reached for a child and felt her hands become clumsy, the way fingers do when they've been asleep the wrong way. She set the child down and could not remember why. The girl lay there, face to the floor, breathing nothing and everything. A man sitting on a stool in a courtyard blinked again, frowned at the loss of his own breath, and slid sideways with an offended expression, like a host interrupted by a rude guest. A boy woke because the world had misplaced its sounds. He could not hear the radio in the neighbor's house. He could not hear dogs. He could not even hear mosquitoes. He stood in the threshold, and the air at his feet was a river. He took one step into it and began to cough, as if his body had decided to surrender one organ at a time. He stepped back. The cough, faithful to physics, stopped. He put his head higher and found that the world, for the moment, required only that he be taller. On the lake, the whitening froth smoothed out. Underneath, the cold deep had released its store. A physical chemist descending later would find the numbers begged the comparison to a carbonated drink strapped shut too long, shaken, then uncorked with an elbow. But unlike a bottle foaming over a glass, this gas had somewhere to go besides the table. Carbon dioxide, at the concentrations released, is heavier than the mix of nitrogen and oxygen we call breath. The night, cool and still as if holding a recipe, kept the cloud close to the ground. Where the bowl of the crater was emptying itself, the gas rolled out low, hugging the floor of the valleys. It did not climb unless pushed to do so. Those in huts on hillocks sat up and coughed, and then did not. Those in hammocks slung high in rafters woke and fumbled for a cup of water, and then, hearing nothing and understanding less, tried not to sleep again. On the road, the truck driver made it to the rail and pulled his chest above the line where the river of air ran. He was not strong, but he was stubborn. And stubbornness is a match for many things. He gulped a single breath, so sweet it burned. He tilted his head back like a man drinking gratitude and started to climb. His foot slipped on the door sill. His knee hit something metal with a crack he would never remember. He sagged, his chin dropping into the stream. The cloud filled his mouth, and his last thought was not a thought but a hum. Boundaries that are meaningful in daylight breadfruit tree. Low wall. The two big rocks that mark the path meant less than the unseen contour of air. There were pockets where the cloud found refuge. Low bowls where it lingered with a patience that slid past dawn. Fires died as if embarrassed. Flames starved for oxygen guttered, flared, went out. Bicycle tires gave up their roundness as their owners sagged across them. Drivers who had been honking at goats a minute before leaned forward over wheels like men in prayer. Radiators hissed. Silence made itself the sovereign. Later, a man from government would say, even the insects were quiet, and people listening would wonder what he meant until their imagination supplied a field without the burr of wings. Around the outer rim, through stands of eucalyptus and plantain, the fog that was not fog sought the low returns. It poured down riverbeds dry in this season. It slid along goat trails into gullies where children had played. It filled up the rice paddies and then wandered on. In hamlets at the far edges, Fang Sabun, some perched a little higher, woke to coughing and confusion and nausea, stumbled outside and climbed a step to a stool, lifted chin to window height to catch air that still had a right mix. It was a trick older than anyone had taught them. It belonged to every animal that had ever been found in a burrow by a flood. In a few houses, hanging lamps did something fierce and bright at the very end, flaring not out of drama, but out of the simple fact that fire beats hard when it is suffocating, then doesn't to beat it all. There is a cruelty in an invisible disaster. There is no flame to outrun, no water to climb away from, no ash to wipe from your eyes. The mothers could not put wet cloths across faces. The fathers could not shovel a trench. They fell where they slept or stood, mid-motion. A child outside under the mango tree lay amid mangoes she had knocked down at dusk. Her eyes were opened away bodies leave eyes when there has been no struggle. The absence of struggle was what broke the grown men later. Night held its dark. The gas did its work. The lake combed to its usual polished black. By first light, those who had kept their heads higher than the cloud, who had sat up on tall stools, who had been spared by a higher sill, who had slept on a raised bed lifted horse. Prez no one answered because the neighbors were not sleeping. A man on the ridge above Saboom stepped out and looked down for smoke and saw none for goats and saw none for the movement. That means a day has begun and saw only the color of morning painted over a motionless scene. He thought earthquake. He thought enemy. He thought spell. He called a name belonging to his sister in the valley. A bird sketched a line across the edge of the sky, and then the sky closed behind it, with no more birds to follow. He ran downslope, ignoring the fear that rose in him like someone else's heartbeat. He ran calling, stumbled into a low place where grass and air sloped. He did not know that the invisible lay there, still, pooled like cold water in a bowl the sun had not yet reached. He felt suddenly drunk, then suddenly old, then suddenly as if he were lying down, then found himself lying down. The name he had been calling the whole way down found the ground without him, and stayed there. The vowel stretched under his cheek as he pressed his face to dirt because instinct promised there might be breath in the soil if there was none in the air. He came back to himself because the slope did what slopes do. It took a little of the weight away. The faintest thread of wind pulled along the grass. He lifted his head into that river and tasted life. He crawled, using his elbows. The valley ahead had taken a pledge of silence. He crawled into it anyway. Bodies lay in patterns that made no sense if you needed heroism to tell you where to put your sorrow. They lay under beds, across doorways, under cooking pots, half sitting on stools. Some faces were open, as if listening. Some mouths were parted so gently you would think a name had been left there like a seed. A girl's braid had loosened and trailed across her throat. In a field, cattle had fallen as if obeying a choreographer. Parallelly, noses almost touching ground, tails outstretched in an indecorous line. A dog lay clasped around a goat kid, as if the old stories had, for one night, been allowed to insist on tenderness. When the first men from Womb and Kumbo, and small towns in between arrived sheriff's assistants, neighbors, anyone with a radio that had. Bert each took one step into the valley, then another, then stopped because the world took their breath in small, efficient bites. They put cloths over their mouths, because cloth has served people for smoke. The cloth made no difference. The red knee height was wrong. They learned quickly to walk higher, to stay to the edges, where the slope offered thinner layers of death. They learned to stand on stones. They learned to leave the dead where they were long enough to check the next house. The lessons were terrible and immediate. A few survivors met them with hands and eyes, too large for their faces. A woman on a stool had fallen forward, face in arms, and when lifted, gasped and beat at her rescuers as if they were the ones stealing air. There were survivors who told later of headaches like iron bands, of a taste in the mouth like sour ash, of waking to find a house full of people who would not wake. They were fathers who had slept light and woke light, and then carried children who would not be carried beyond a step. Fathers who set them down and told themselves they would just be a moment, just check the neighbor, just go get help and return, knowing even then that time is a river that does not back up. They began to count instinctively and then stopped because numbers insisted on cold metal. The men and women from the district offices gathered under a eucalyptus and made of their shirts a pile of masks that helped no one. A radio crackled with voices from the capital that spoke of trucks and doctors and unknown agent. The rumor that matters most after a mystery death arrived on the wind with no science and every certainty. Poison. This answer had the advantage of being simple and wrong. From the national police came men with pistols who were not enemies, but whose presence would be filed away by memory under the drawer labeled threat. A truck from a mission clinic came bumping along with a nurse in the back who had never seen a day so quiet and would never again call any silence peace. She had oxygen in steel canisters. She set masks over faces and watched people sit up from their own funerals. She cried a little, not for herself, and put the mask on the next person and the next, until the steel cylinders told her in their small voices that they had nothing more to offer. There was no smoke to direct her where to go. She followed the knot smell in the heavy air and found, this day, that the dead pull you with a gravity equal to the living. By noon, the valleys far down Windfang, Sabum were half empty of the cloud, the sun having finally found the bowls and lifted what could be lifted. People who had climbed into trees now climbed down, joints stiff, mouths bitter, eyes full of the kind of disbelief that knows exactly what it is. Disbelieving, they walked into their houses and came out, carrying nothing because there was nothing to carry that mattered. They sat down on earth that had arranged itself into a floor before any house was built and let the grief put them into shapes old as clay. A journalist from Yunda arrived with a camera that would later show the world something worse than fire or blood. The press of book against stillness, with the details that make it human bare feet, a bracelet, the ragged hem of a shirt. He filmed a valley where even the leaves seemed subdued, damp with dew that had formed where the cold breath of the lake condensed on warm surfaces. He filmed a horsefly lying near a boy's ear. He filmed a man who had tried to run uphill and made it as far as the low wall and then eased himself down as if to rest, head against stone, hands open. Later, when the footage played in living rooms on the far side of oceans, people would look for a villain and find only the earth. Scientists arrived too, stepping gently, their seriousness shaped by long practice. A volcanologist, with the dust of the Icelandic highlands in his hair and accustomed to the heartbreak of numbers, took water samples by the shore of a lake that looked like a bruise. The water smelled of life that had been shaken. It stained as if it had more iron than it should. The men measured the pH and found sourness. They dropped a sampler bottle down on a line and winched it up and unscrewed the cap like a priest opening a reliquary. Bubbles rose. One of them tilted the bottle under his nose and shook his head, not because he smelled death CO2 as a quiet guess, but because the edges of the story had been found. A lake with a belly full of gas, a river of unseen air. They remembered Monon what little had been known in 1984, and suspected then only in a few cautious papers. A limnic eruption. A deep lake fed by volcanic CO2. Layers undisturbed for decades. A sudden overturn, peeling the fizz out of a water column and turning it into a killing fog rolling outward. They spoke their word meramitic, and it sounded obscene. They took breath after a tiny respectful breath, and stood very still, calculating the kind of math that feels like sin when bodies are near. How many tons of gas, how far could it travel, how long does it linger, where will it go next? They drove old nails into a chest-high tree and tied a cloth so that they would notice, if they had to return days later, whether the lake level had dropped, whether the wave from whatever had happened had chewed at the banks. They asked men who still had voices where the cloud had gone. The men pointed the way rivers always point. Down. When the day wore out, a priest took a bell and walked house to house in Nyos. He rang the bell above thresholds. No one came. He put the bell down and helped with the work of collecting. You have to choose which dead to attend to first. You would think grief would make the choice random, but the living are practical. They go to the young first, and then to the names the oldest mouths carry. They dug trenches shallow enough to be made quickly and deep enough to keep dogs from exhuming relatives. They put bodies together who had not gotten together easily in life. People from far villages came and stood at a distance because they had been told to, because even grief had to learn a new etiquette. Do not breathe where the ground dips. By sunset, the first orders came down from the capital. A zone would be declared. No one was to live within it until a cause free of conspiracy could be named. Trucks arrived with cloth and water, and men, used to telling other men where to stand their sorrow. They were not cruel. They did not know what else to do. In the light of a late fire itself, now possible again. Bright in the way flame is when it has no competition, a paper was signed. Stamped. In a day, the villages would be ghost maps. The earth, indifferent. Cooled under the first true breeze since night. At the lake, bubbles still rose as if it had not yet finished telling what it had to tell. A scientist in a sweater that had seen other winters watched the surface and thought of the pressure curve of water. How each 10 meters weighs down with another atmosphere. How CO2 hides under that pressure like a secret. He spoke aloud to no one in particular, the way some men talk to instruments. It is like a bottle aside softly that has been opened. He looked at the hills where people slept with gasoline beside. Their beds because the lamps had betrayed them. He imagined a pipe reaching down into that blackness, giving the lake a throat, letting it whisper instead of shout. He wrote that thought in a notebook with a stub of pencil and underlined it twice. Then closed the book as the night cooled and smelled of plant breath and damp stone, a smell that would in time come to mean to him the day the earth corrected a mistake only it knew it had made. In the months that followed, Lake Nyos acquired an apparatus. Steel pipes lay on the slope like punctuation waiting to be stood upright. Engineers with ideas older than their faces sketched loops and valves on the backs of envelopes, then bent metal to match the lines, then adjusted the bends to match the reality of a lake that did not care. The degassing plan looked absurd if you did not know the physics. Lower a pipe into the deep layer where CO2 hid. Prime it with a pump to start the flow. Let the gas coming out of solution reduce the density of the column inside the pipe until the lake did the pumping itself. A fountain would climb out of the lake, throwing water and gas into the air, turning a once-in-decades explosion into a continuous hiss. The first test came years later because roads in that country do not bow to urgent plans, and because money, even in the presence of the dead, finds ways to hesitate. In 2001, the first pipe went in. It was ugly. It was perfect. A French engineer named Michel Halboix stood with Cameroonian technicians and watched the water begin to spit. It stuttered like a nervous flute tenant cowed. A white column rose from the lake with a sound like 100 kettles forgetting themselves at once. It stayed. The people on the rim stepped back and then did not leave. They watched because the fountain had the grace of a promise. This, in time, can be made safe. At Monon, where the disaster had been smaller, pipes had already been tried. Lake Nyos demanded more. One pipe was not enough to bleed off decades of stored breath. In stages, as engineers, geochemists, ministers, and donors dodged each other's calendars, more were added until 3 stood in their braces, coughing. Each hiss gave back to the air what the earth had given the water in the wrong place. The bubbles made rainbows in the mist. Children in nearby resettlement camps were told they could not go to the rim, and so they went as far as they dared and then bragged the distance into legend. While the fountains worked their quiet violence, something larger and lower on the hill brooded. Lake Nyos is held back on one side by a natural dam, a pile of volcanic rubble and ash, with a little soil knitted over it by roots. In the wet season, rain slicked its face and promised nothing. The wave that came the night of the outgassing had carved at its inner edge. Engineers laid hands on it and felt, beneath the skin, the old bones loose. If the dam were to fail, a wall of water would take the valleys with a speed no one would outrun and tear down villages much farther afield than the gas had reached. The fear was not a headline. Doomsday Dam. It was real. The government posted men with sticks to keep goats from the toe of the wall. UNESCO reports gathered dust and then blew into attention. People who had lost their families to her side when told the water, which had always been a friend, now had ambitions. Plans were made. Budgets hovered like vultures. In 2015, civil works to lower the lake level and buttress the dam began in earnest. A notch would be cut to make a safer spillway. The lake's lip made lower, so less water pressed at the weak place. Stone would be dumped, a skeleton for new skin to grow over. In the meantime, the degassing pipes needed diesel for a pump, only to start after that the fountain, own gas-powered but diesel in that country, competes with too many needs. There were days when the fountain stuttered, and those who listened from a village's edge tilted their heads because they had learned when a kettle sounds wrong. The investigation that had seemed absurd the first day solidified into a canon. The carbon came not from rotting leaves, as some early speculations had allowed, but from magma along the Cameroon volcanic line. The lake was a crater perched on it, a mouth scaled to local measures. Gas rose through fractures, dissolved into the pressurized deep and waited. The flip that released it could be blamed on a landslide or on just the wrong wind meeting. Just the wrong rain. Blame is a word too human for the physics. It is better to say the system had reached the threshold. The scientist who had written Throat in his notebook drew a different line now. A gradual slope of decreasing concentrations projected into a future where panic could be replaced by routine. Not everyone waited for the future to behave. Some people, forbidden to return to their old farms, did so anyway. The soils around Nyos had been ingenious volcanic richness that made corn shoulders heavy, coffee plants glossy and hardworking, plantains fat. It is hard to argue with dirt when it has fed your parents and your grandparents. A resettlement plot, far from the lake, offered stone and old sand, a stingy mix. The government posted guards and then looked away as families slipped back. A new generation grew around the lake's edge, its children warned away from the rim and told not to light lamps on nights when the wind lay down. The memory of the morning after did not leave the survivors. In interviews years later, their voices carried an authority that has nothing to do with school. I woke up and everyone was dead, they said without flinching or theater. A man described walking the length of his village with a leaf held at mouth height. If the leaf fluttered, he walked on. If it lay still, he stepped back uphill. A woman explained how a baby at the breast had made it through, because she had been sleeping in a high-slung cloth cradle when the cloud came, while her brothers in the next room did not. Physics, indifferent, had noticed bed construction. If the fountains are the sound of safety, the calculations behind them remain the texture of fear. Scientists clipped sensors to ropes and sent them down the pipes. The graphs they printed out in Jungolo or Dula or back home in Europe or America traced lines that understood only concentration. The levels dropped, but slowly. The lake's breadth had been measured in millions of tons. Its size were measured in hundreds a day. Each wet season, new gas rose. Each dry season, wind drew less and less of the surface into the depth. Some foreign reporters flew in and took a picture and called the problem solved. The engineers shook their heads and returned to the valves. In villages downstream of the dam, town elders learned a new way to cast lots. If the dam goes now, which path does the water take? Which house turns into a raft? Which field turns into a river? Sheets of clear plastic with colored lines on them were laid over paper maps on tables laid on other tables because there were no desks. Hands traced the routes of roads in the old course of a stream that remembered being young. They marked where to run from, where to tie a rope if you could get to the mango tree in time. Meanwhile, the lake had acquired something else, tourists. The tragedies of the earth become a curriculum for the curious. A tour van rolled up one afternoon with a man who wanted to stand in the place where air had killed without blood and say aloud, "I am here." He paid a boy in a faded soccer jersey to lead him closer than was allowed. The boy took him by a path fleece-lush with fern and told him in Cameroonian French, with proud consonants, how the pipe worked. The man went home and posted a photo under the caption, "Killer Lake timed," and one of the engineers saw it years later on a cousin's phone and felt a flash of anger so clean it made him laugh. After an afternoon of watching the water punch its own sky, the scientist with the pencil returned to his room, turned on a battery light, and wrote down the things that remained unresolved. Is there a trigger to seek, or is the trigger always simply time? Could a cold wind and hard rain do it again? How fast can we lower the concentration? How eager is the earth below to breathe again? He underlined those two, less firmly than the first. In the morning, at the rim, villagers stood with sacks and waited for the government truck that came, weekly now with sugar and kerosene payment for their cooperation with a line drawn on a map. The boy edged toward a discarded ladder propped against a pipe's brace, curiosity its own gravity. His sister, older by a few wise years, grabbed his collar as he reached up and pulled him back just as a gust lifted the fountain's spray into the path. Flecks of cold on the air, falling with a hiss that sounded for a heartbeat like the day the lake breathed wrong. The water fell. The pipe thundered on. The boy yelped and laughed and wriggled free and ran off to chase a goat that had never learned what the boundary meant. His sister watched him go with the expression of exasperated love that mothers and brothers wear everywhere. Across the lake, a shovel bit soil as men cut the notch deeper for the spillway, the new outlet that would lower the surface, ease the strain on the dam. Dump trucks canted under loads of stone that would become new bones for the old embankment. The work progressed, the way work in such places does. 3 good days. 2 stalled by rain. A week waiting for a part to arrive from a city where the part had been waiting for payment to clear in an office where one of the files was lost. Yet, it progressed. A decade after the pipes began to sing, a visiting team lowered a probe into the deepest water and watched the numbers climb and then, gratifyingly, keep climbing less. CO2 concentrations at depth had fallen by more than half from their peak. The danger had not gone. The lake still took in gas from below. It would for as long as the volcano beneath exhaled. But the bottle's cap had been loosened and left askew. Pressure would not again build for a surprise the same size. Or so the math put its hand up and swore. Families returned in their own slow time. The way vines returned to a cleared patch. They planted. They married. They left in the loud Cameroonian way that lets a sound out that does not wait for permission. They pointed to a line on the house wall where the damp had climbed that night and told their youngest, There is where the air came. They told them to sleep higher, never on a mat on the low floor. They told them to watch the wind lie flat in the late evening. They taught them, without quite saying so, to fear what cannot be seen without medicine. In the cities, the story of Nyos lived in laboratories and in documentary voiceovers that believed in ghosts. Lake Nyos, degassed, with its own smaller throat, fell off the news and into the list of Solvad Lake Kivu, on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. A giant with methane and CO2 storehouses dwarfed only by the people on its shores, took its place on risk maps that made policymakers blink. Engineers drew pipes on their pads and submitted pages to commissions. A power plant began to sip Kivu's methane and turn it into electricity. A pragmatism born from the way fear and need can be made to recognize each other. The villagers Nyos carried the quieter part of the lesson. In one house, a woman who had been lifted off a stool that morning in 1986 tended to a small girl now, daughter of a daughter she had not, at the time, expected to have. She told stories of goats with names of brothers who could dance, of a priest's bell. She took the child by the hand one day and walked her to the stone where her father had been found, resting his head. She said in a language not written in any of the tourist brochures, that the earth is old and forgets us, and remembers us, that it can be kind without liking us, that sometimes it breathes wrong, that we live here anyway, that we pay attention, that we belong without owning. The numbers settled into reference books, roughly 1,746 people dead. Up, 2, 3, 500 cattle, gas traveling as far as 25 kilometers. The lake's surface dropped a meter or two that night, a geyser rising dozens of meters, a column of water and gas feeding itself as it rose. There were arguments about the triggers in journals that print sentences with more commas than verbs. There were arguments about responsibility in bars, where men who wear uniforms opened their palms to prove they carried no poison. There were grudges the villagers held quietly against a government that, in their view, had made slowness holy. There was gratitude, too, for the days their children stood in spray like rain and did not fall. One dry season, when the wind came down from Nigeria, hot and full of far dust, a doctor from the first clinic returned to the valley. She stepped down from a pickup and looked at the line of houses rebuilt, some left-leaning. She remembered the weight of steel cylinders in her hands. She remembered the sudden upsetting of an old man when oxygen kissed his brain. She remembered the way silence has a texture you can almost fold. She greeted a woman on a doorstep whose hair had gone silver and whose eyes were as direct as they had been the day she woke to find every cousin absent. They said little of the past. They asked after children and roofs and drillers for wells. They watched a goat nibble the hem of a boy's shirt and both laughed. Far off, in offices where maps are turned into money and laws, the Nyos disaster became a case study in hazard that is hard to imagine before it happens. Plans were made for highland crater lakes in Ethiopia, in the Andes, in the Virunga chain. Manuals were written that had never been written before. How to digalale, how to lore a natural dam without making it fail. How to tell people kindly and without contempt that a place is dangerous, without banishing them from it forever. Scientists taught scientists. Engineers taught to love valves. People learned, again, that the rare sits beside the likely and asks to be seen to. When the sun drops behind the ridge now, the pipe fountains turn gold for a moment. The sound they make is like someone frying breakfast in a kitchen you have not found yet. Birds fly across the lake, fast and low, unbothered by physics. The boy who almost climbed to the ladder has grown into shoes his father used to wear. He knows to stand on the step when his chest feels tight on cool nights. He knows the path through elephant grass, where the slope saves you. He carries a small radio that crackles news from far capitals and high stadiums, and sometimes nothing at all. There is no monument in Nyos that says, "This is where the era learned to kill." There are stones. There are names. There is the line on the house wall. There is the fountain like a throat giving back. There is a road where a truck still sits, rusted into the memory of the bend. On some nights, a wind slips down and skims the lake flat. The fountains breathe. The pipes sing their one note. The valley does not answer. The dead have the last word, and that word is a quiet that instructs without scolding. The living listen. The village vanished overnight. It returned in a different shape. The lake that killed learned a new way to speak. The lesson traveled farther than the cloud did. That the planet keeps surprises at the bottoms of beautiful places. That listening to water can save you. That the air around us is not promised but borrowed. That we can make the borrowing last. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.